Right. Welcome to another unrehearsed intellectual adventure with myself, David Didau, and Martin Robinson. Obviously, nobody has been asking for this, but we decided to inflict it on you anyway. And today, whether you want us to or not, we're going to talk about culture, and we're going to talk about this culture as expanded upon here by Edward Tyler, which takes in basically everything. So we're going to talk about high culture, low culture, cultural capital, common culture, being cultured, and anything else that we can think of that vaguely relates to this as an idea. If you're a keen observer of Martin Robinson's behaviour, then you know that he's been talking about culture on his own, and we'll probably rehash some of those thoughts that he's discussed in his talks. Martin, where would you start off? I think probably we'd start by sort of saying that this is something that seems to be particularly acutely felt in schools at the moment due to the intervention of Ofsted saying that schools are meant to teach children cultural capital.
Yeah. Okay. So the thing about cultural capital is its association with Bourdieu and the idea of what cultural capital might actually be. And I think there's a lot of confusion over it, in that Ofsted in the end said that it's not to do with Bourdieu's, it's our idea of cultural capital, and to get themselves out of the argument about you're not being Bourdieuian about it. There's also the best that's been thought and said idea, which is the Matthew Arnold idea of culture,
which is enshrined in the national curriculum now.
Which is there in the national curriculum. So these things are all in the milieu that we have to look at and discuss. And there's also powerful knowledge, I think, comes into it as well, which is, whether we want to or not. I don't think we need to do that here but it's all about saying, well, basically we want to teach posh stuff to kids.
Latin.
We want to teach Latin to sheep, or whatever we call it, But this whole idea that we're going to teach the best that's been thought and said, which generally is, well, you can name it: Latin, classical music, classical civilization, the great European tradition, the great books, the great arts, the great music, all these sorts of things, in order to release the poor from their ghettos and get them into socially mobile, to all go to Oxford and Cambridge.
The study of perfection.
The study of perfection for sweetness and light, indeed, to become better people. And the only thing that's stopping them from being rich is their education, and they just need to be taught a bit of Shakespeare. Brush up on your Shakespeare.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So it's Eliza Doolittle all the way.
Yes.
Henry
right.
Higgins.
Right. And so for Arnold, obviously, you were saying there about classical literature. For him, English literature was a particular way in that so he was interested in ideas of common culture and sort of vernacular culture. He wasn't just simply an elitist, was he?
Well, it's an interesting point that he certainly wasn't just about education for the elite. He thought anyone could achieve enlightenment, if you like, by sweetness and light, by being raised through the culture around them. So it's an almost religious devotion to culture to raise us up. And he did look at all classes rather disparagingly as Philistines and barbarians. Yeah. So he looked despairingly at the world that was around him, but also the riots that were happening at the time, and looking at those riots and the anarchy that was loosed upon the world. What he would want to try and do is say, well, we need culture to stop moments of anarchy happening. So, to take the way this sort of barbaric way of behaving as well. But the barbarians, I think, were the upper classes, and the
Yeah,
Philistines were the middle classes. I think
I
that's
think that's right. Yeah,
yeah,
and
yeah.
I can't remember what he called the hoi polloi.
Yes. I can't remember. I've got it somewhere, but
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, yeah.
So, and for, I think for Arnold, and I think for the Victorian society that he was lived in, that there was a feeling that religion no longer had the same sort of sway on public morality that it once had, and that in Arnold's view, this role could be taken up by culture instead of as a replacement for religion.
And you've got to take into account his father, who was the headmaster of rugby school, and both of them very revolutionary figures in their own way. These and it's only because of someone like Matthew Arnold that culture becomes an important word, an important way of seeing the world at all. So thanks to his father imbuing the whole ethos of rugby school with a sort of enlightened way of teaching and learning and all those things, that I think Matthew Arnold then becomes the first Her Majesty's Inspector of Schools or something like that.
Yeah, he from the 1850s, I think 1852 to 1888, something like that. He was. I don't think he was chief inspector the whole time. He was an inspector,
Yeah.
and it makes fascinating reading. I think I've got a copy of his. Maybe I haven't. Yeah, I have. That's at the time, for most of this, obviously, or a good part of this, schooling isn't compulsory, and I think later from the 1870s that schooling becomes compulsory up to the age of 13, I think it was, and you get this wonderful sense of Arnold going into these schools and just being appalled at the teaching involved in no way is imparting this idea of civilization. And I think at one point he talks about the fact that the only literature that children have access to is in their Bible, for all the good. The rest of it is just rote memorization and beatings, and you can sense his despair. It's quite visceral. He obviously cares passionately that in his conception of culture for all, it's. So we get from Arnold. Go on.
I just want to pick up one word you mentioned there, which is civilization. So to be civilized. So the idea of culture as growing, and it's where it comes from as a word. It's this idea of being encultured. You're changing people. You're growing the crop is culture as well.
Yeah, horticulture. Yeah.
So this sort of idea of culture as a way of improvement, of making things better, making people better, and this, which is different than Tyler's view, with where we started with the quote there, which culture is the way of things are, the way we live. This is culture. Arnold's idea of culture is more along the lines of cultural capital, though Bourdieu doesn't think it necessarily improves you as a human being, but it's a way to get to be bourgeois, something like that, kind of. Whereas Arnold actually is thinking of, well, no, it improves you. It'll improve your life. Culture improves your life. So it is a graceful thing. So to be civilized.
Tyler's a rough contemporary with Arnold, isn't he?
Yeah.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about his development of ideas and its contribution?
Very briefly, the fork between the two is interesting. That Arnold's idea of culture takes us down to Leavis and people like that, whereas Tyler's view of culture takes us to anthropology and an anthropological view. And to some extent, because of the Victorian view at that time, whatever, the anthropological view is very useful for looking at other people's societies.
Yes.
Rather than necessarily our own. So it doesn't necessarily offer a critical view of our own culture, so to speak. But later it becomes, it becomes more about that. And we have this balance between the two views of culture which are most prevalent between these two. One of which is civilizing you, and the other one is the way things are here, the way we do things here. So the culture is lived, or the culture is something to aspire to.
Right, and this probably helps to understand why Raymond Williams talks about culture as being one of the most complicated words in the language.
Yeah, so one of the three, I can't remember what the other two words are, but that would be interesting in itself. But culture is such a complex word because you can't pin it down, or you can pin it down to mean anything you particularly want it to mean in any particular context. So if you think of culture being the arts, for instance, or then you also get people talking about the arts and culture. So culture there is museums and other things. Then there's culture, media and sport, as though media and sport aren't part of culture.
Right.
But then you've got the culture of sport and you've got media culture, So, we culture is either a very big thing, or it's a description of a throwaway description of anything, or it's something elitist, which or specialized in its own.
And I think in some ways it almost acts as a dog whistle, and has for some time. That I think there's quite a famous quote. I think it's Henry Ford who said, "Whenever I hear the word culture, I reach for my gun." And so he obviously sees it as something to be resisted. Whereas we might sort of look at that and say, well, the culture of reaching for your gun is quite different from the culture we might occupy ourselves.
And it would take an American to reach for their gun, of course, because it's American culture.
Exactly. So trying to get at what we mean by culture is important. Now, in the context of education in schools in England at the moment, I think there's a particular preoccupation with this because of the way that cultural capital has been handed to schools as something that they must do. And I think one of the things I notice in visiting schools and talking to teachers is that sometimes you hear that yes, we've done cultural capital, but we've taken them all to a museum. They've gone to the theatre. We've had a writer come in and do some work with them. They've watched a ballet. They've done all of this stuff. So we've done cultural capital, and which and I'm not being I'm not being deliberately dismissive of that, and I'm not saying that those things don't have value, but I think it draws a distinction between being cultured and what it might be to possess cultural capital.
Yeah, so being cultured here. So culture is what you ain't got.
Yes.
You ain't got culture. So we're going to give you some culture. This is what it's like. And it's boring. We know it's boring, but you're not allowed to yawn.
Yes, you go round the museum with your worksheet and you find stuff out and it makes you better.
Yeah, culture is something that you really have nothing to do with. Arendt writes about the crisis of culture in one of her crisis essays, and she talks about what culture becomes this sort of strange thing that it's like, I don't know, Hyacinth Bucket or Hyacinth Bouquet, that character, that is something that you try on. It's not really part of you, but you're going to sort of try it on to as a snobbery. It gets a snob value. So you go to the ballet because it's the right thing to do, but you don't really understand it. You don't really get into it. And yet ballet is an extraordinarily rich art form, that can be experienced beautifully and well, and should be, but to go there, it's like part of the season. So Glyndebourne, Henley, all these things that a certain class of people put on, which is the cultural capital idea, the habitus. We're going to wear these things, we're going to do these things, we're going to eat these things, meet these people, behave in a certain way in order to become the Henry Higgins character, the Eliza Doolittle, who's got all the rough edges knocked off her and can pass as somebody that they're not, which is a very strange understanding of culture. And if schools are doing that, I think they're not feeding any form of culture at all. They're making culture this strange thing that's alien, that's absolutely nothing to do with you, that's a tick box, that makes culture something that they do over there that I don't quite like or understand or get into, and is not part of my life. And that's a problematic thing. And I use this example of people going to the Victorian theatres, where the rich would sit in the boxes at the side and be seen to be at the theatre, but they're in the worst seats. They're in the worst seats possible to experience the theatre. And that's kind of taking kids along to something that's good for them. This is good for you. Shut up. That you're actually just taking them to be seen to be there, that you've ticked that box, but they haven't actually understood or imbued what the theatre is about, or the play is about, or these other things. Anyway, go on.
No, I think, and in almost perhaps in opposition to that, you've got the Hirschian view of the utilitarian nature of culture, the idea of cultural literacy, that knowing about these things gives you access. It's the knowledge of power. It's the, left uncultivated, it becomes the preserve of the elite. And yet, if we value democracy, if we value social justice, then giving people that don't have access to ideas and are able to recognise, and I think that this gets caricatured in his 1980s book Cultural Literacy, which had that appendix of, I think, was it 5,000 things that every American needs to know, and it became caricatured as simply as a list. That if you can tick all of these things off this list, then you can read the New York Times or whatever newspaper it was they derived the list from, and it's all disassociated. It's just learning a list by some kind of rote. And I think that early in his career, he even sort of talked about the fact that you'd be as well to read short study guides as actual works of literature, because they contain all the essential ideas that you need to recognise. That as long as you can recognise Room 101 and Big Brother, you don't need to have read 1984. That's there's a lot of extra pages in there which don't consider the bits that are necessary. And I think that's an idea that's also exerting influence at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's a very salient point, actually. I mean, the amount of information that's there in order to read the New York Times, let's say, which is probably thinner than it used to be, but let's give it, because you've got the sports pages, the business pages, the theatre reviews, the dance reviews, the opera, the news, the economic news, whichever bit you want. That's a huge range of stuff. And the difference between range and depth, and can you tick off everything? And no, I don't think you can tick off everything. But also to acknowledge, America is a strange place as well. I mean, America is a big place with a lot of different cultures within that culture. So I think that this idea of unifying a culture, which has so many disparate elements, that size of something is quite a task. And I think that's part of his task, was to try and to bring people into a sort of establish the broadsheet newspaper as the common culture place, and whether that is the right place for it, or whether culture comes from below or can be in a newspaper or not, I don't know if those things
and he acknowledges that there's a tension between the aim of deprivileging those who are currently privileged and sort of being, sort of not accepting that the world as it is, but also that if you want to, I think in his words, he talks about giving children entree to the knowledge of power, then the knowledge that you teach is necessarily fairly traditional, because in order to be widely shared, in order to have entered into common currency, it's probably been around for quite a long time. it's probably therefore, something that we might want to sort of look at as fairly hidebound, stale, male, pale, all of these sorts of negative things, and there's a genuine tension there that I think rightly probably upsets people and gets them aerated. And I think in an attempt to sort of resolve that, how we go about resolving that is an important step. And I think one of the things that you could bring to that is to say that, if it's important that children possess cultural literacy, that they're able to access shared knowledge, they're able to access the ideas of a wider community beyond their own necessarily limited experiences, then that's an important starting point from which you can then start to critique and challenge and tear down the bits that don't meet with your approval. But you can't perhaps do that from a position of ignorance.
Right. I mean, I don't know if cultural literacy is there so you can tear it down. I mean, that's more like Bourdieu, though. Bourdieu sort of get into positions of power and then destroy it all from within. The march through the institutions and all this, the long march through the institution, destroy it all, and then we have an egalitarian society. But the trouble is, the people who get into institutions forget to do the destruction bit.
Yes,
they go native with it. They become part of the institution.
No, it was ever thus. It would appear that the people, the bastards, they won't rise to the occasion and be as we would want them to be. And but if we,
can I just sort of question this thing about the knowledge of the powerful knowledge, this sort of idea that culture as class-based, because then you have working class culture. Now, someone like Raymond Williams would resist the idea of working class culture as such. He believed in common culture. He believed in a folk culture, but he thought the working class culture wasn't a real thing. That it was made too quick to be born from the class itself, and a lot of popular culture is imposed upon the hoi polloi to bread and circuses sort of idea. This will entertain you, and within that, perhaps it would take a long time to build a proper popular culture up that isn't manufactured and given to you. So whose knowledge becomes a strange thing. Is it knowledge of the marketplace? Who has the power in all this? And those people who are sort of beyond that, therefore, that either are so poor or so rich as to not worry about such things. Do they have culture at all in that case? They don't need it. Have no need of culture at all.
And there would be people who would argue that the most widely shared knowledge now might include knowledge of football, Banksy, things which have greater common currency perhaps than Shakespeare and Tchaikovsky and the classics.
If it's what you read in the newspaper, it's nothing to do with quality.
No,
it's to do with what's popular, what sells that newspaper at a certain time. So if you pick up cultural references, there we go, that occur in a lot of writing in broadsheet, what used to be broadsheet newspapers, a lot of it is popular cultural references that people use rather than high classical things. It's almost that whole biblical classical world has gone from newspapers, being replaced by references to Jade Goody or Gascoigne or these people that were in the 80s and 90s and noughties perhaps that the writers in those newspapers pull upon because that's their culture now.
And you're obviously right. There's definitely some of that, but you're still expected to understand, a passing reference to an Achilles heel, or to,
Yeah.
you know,
But
if somebody refers to the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, we're all meant to know that that's somebody having a run of bad luck. You know, that we're meant to recognise it and nod and go, oh, that's probably, you know, important.
I think Achilles heel is to a point now that it's lost its reference, but it has its own reference. It's your Achilles heel becomes a thing. You don't need to know about Achilles.
Right.
Or his heel, for that matter. You just become the Achilles heel.
Yeah, or about him being dipped in the Styx.
Yeah.
Okay, so the idea then that we should teach cultural capital. We've got two things. First, we've got this idea of, you know, enculturating children, exposing them to things which will make them better. We've got the idea that it is in some way empowering, that it will make them, it'll give them access to a world beyond their experience. But we've also, if we go back to Tyler's quote, we've also got the idea that culture is the sum total of human wisdom. It's our human inheritance. It's perhaps Michael Oakeshott's idea of the conversation of mankind that we should all be able to participate in.
Yeah, which is, if it's the way we do things here, and that brings in who is the we and what is the here at any particular moment, and that in itself is a big conversation. But culture is everything. So we are indulging in a cultural activity, no matter what we do. So it's the way we interpret the world, the way we see the world, the way the world sees us, and it's this sort of two-way thing from the individual to the group and back again, and the group being artifacts as well as human beings, as well as human beings in the past who made artifacts. And whether you drive on the left, drive on the right, or whatever you do, it's the way that things are done, the habits, the belief systems, all this, it becomes the way of making meaning. It's the way that we see the world. It's the mythos, if you like, the myth, the myths that are around us that help us to actually make a sense of the world in which we are in. Then it becomes very loose. Culture is everything, is everything that's not of the natural world, if you like. So it's
and arguably the natural world is a cultural invention.
Exactly. And the way we see the mythos, the way we see the natural world is in itself part of the cultural world. So the milieu, everything around us, how we relate to the world and how it relates to us is culture. Now, if you start saying that and start seeing it in those terms, then the whole Arnoldian thing becomes problematic. But then you also get the possibility of everything's the same.
Well,
relative. It's all relative.
Yeah.
This culture's not, this bit's not better than that bit. This isn't better than that bit. Whereas to me, actually, it opens up that world of saying, well, what is better than what, and all that. But anyway, yeah.
No, you're absolutely. But so we've got a few things, a few strands possibly to pick up on here. And one of them that you mentioned, it was that it makes problematic the Arnoldian view that the study of perfection leads to sweetness and light. And you know, the 20th century was a real psychic shock for that tradition. And I think it was George Steiner who wrote about, you know, the incongruity of somebody able to read Rilke and listen to Wagner and then go to work in Auschwitz, and that if culture does improve us, that doesn't seem to fit with what happened during those years.
Yeah, it's Wagner is a difficult. It's a difficult one.
Then, you know, I
love his stuff, but he's a very flawed, difficult character. But what we got is interesting. There is the Germanic culture, the whole history of German culture, and what the both world wars did to Germanic culture, and how it in terms of classical music, in terms of philosophy, in terms, so we've got Goethe, Beethoven, I don't know, Nietzsche, you know, Hegel,
Schopenhauer,
whatever.
Heidegger.
Great, you know, and
And,
then Heidegger, and you get to Heidegger, and everything starts to fall apart. Or if people get, you know,
yes, of course.
So Heidegger and Wagner and Nietzsche and all this sort of thing, but it becomes problematic. But also the making of the German nation that's brought into it, because you know,
Deutschland, Deutschland über alles.
well, and then the making of it, and then what happens to Germany in the 20th century, and what happened to German culture after that is quite interesting. We get Kraftwerk, Volkswagen, but it becomes technical, scientific. It can run it. It knows how to run. It works on an epidemic well, you know.
Yeah.
How to deal with an epidemic. So efficient, yeah, all those things that become. But the great cultural desert in football. They can play football, but the other parts of it, the philosophy, the art, the music certainly is not where it was. But Kraftwerk, I could make an argument for Kraftwerk, saying perhaps it place. But certainly it changed a lot, and it's interesting how nation and culture can be tied together, or were tied together in a sort of Wagnerian sense, but are also tied together in somewhere like Michaela, the school, Michaela School, who brought out a book about culture, the way we do things here, and you know, the singing of the national anthem, the reciting of If, and all these various ways we do things here.
Yes, the idea that culture eats strategy for breakfast or something along those lines.
Yeah. You know, and tying this sort of thing, that the whole culture of the school about silencing corridors and all the other things that are tied to that, the way we do things here is also tied into a sense of loyalty to nationhood, to a sense of a common culture that is beyond the school as well, which is of interest and very controversial, because a lot of the people at Makeda School aren't white, aren't from a sort of, well, if we talk about a sort of Kipling idea of what Britain, I'll say Britain, but perhaps it's England as well. All these things come in. What is a nation? What makes the culture? All these things come into it. What should we be teaching in school? Should we be teaching Kipling, Dickens, Shakespeare, the sort of a Leavisite idea of the great and the good, which is male, pale, and stale? Or should we be saying, what are the cultures that come to our school? What is cultural enrichment for the people who come here, and bringing in the communities into a common multicultural view, perhaps, or a view that brings in all these things to create a new culture, a new sort of common culture out of all these things.
Where the curriculum is decolonized.
Yeah.
I don't want to spend too much time defending Leavis, of all people, but in his defense, his great tradition consisted of two women, an American and a Pole. So, you know, he's slightly more diverse than one might get. They're all white, so we can cross him out on that score. But you know, the great tradition of British English novelists or English literature starts with Jane Austen, and then runs through George Eliot and Henry James and Conrad, who obviously very controversial figure, who, you know, I think Chinua Achebe, the great Nigerian novelist and literary critic, said was a thoroughgoing racist, and you know, that's you know, should that be part of the great tradition? Do we decolonize? Do we get rid of that sort of stuff? Do we hold it up to our current sensibilities and say it has no value, it should be beyond the pale? Or do we read it critically? Do we acknowledge its faults and flaws and see it as being of a time and place, and not accept it as a worldview that we should adopt, but as an artifact?
Well, I mean, Leavis himself, I mean, famously argued about Dickens. You know, he has this argument with himself about whether Dickens is one of the greats or
When
not.
he lets him in eventually, later.
Eventually, with Hard Times, is it?
Our Hard Times is his favourite, yes, and
So he lets that in. He lets that into
he's a
the.
mere entertainer.
Yeah, you know. Well, so, but I think that book is allowed in the end, isn't it, or something like that. So to get involved in the argument as to what is good or what is not so good and why, the view of the critique of something, the view of the to have a critical view of something, you've got to understand exactly what you think is good and why and all that. And this is where the discussion about what the best might be, what is good within this, becomes very interesting. And I think this takes us back to the conversation, Oakeshot's point of the conversation is,
yes,
if we talk about, well, what is good and what is not so good, in a whole wide range of things. I remember the New Musical Express of the 1970s, which was an extraordinarily snobbish publication about what was in and what wasn't, you know, what was true and what wasn't true, you know, and bands like Queen were disgusting posers, you know, and things like that. Whereas the Sex Pistols were
really quite happy with that.
Yeah, but the Sex Pistols were good. The Clash even better. You know, so this strange sort of idea about what's good, what isn't, is sort of imbued in all parts of culture. You know, what's in, what's out, what's not, what's right, what's wrong, what's good, what's bad, and then everything in between. And it's, to me, is this age-old argument is how to bring the individual, the subjective viewpoint, into the argument of the collective viewpoints. And part of that is argument, dialectic, discussion, and being able to hold your view or change your view because of evidence of, but these are emotional things. A lot of it's emotional. It's about aesthetics, it's about taste, it's about discernment. It's about all those things which a rich education, I think, has to open up, rather than saying, this is the best, this is it, learn it, know it. Absolutely. It's actually saying, is this the best, and trying to weigh things up. Now, obviously, you can't do that to everything, but argument, opinion, political engagement with things becomes important. So if we're saying this is the good culture, and this is the way things are, but it excludes you, then how can you get involved in that? So I think that thing about, well, no, it doesn't include me. And therefore, how do we engage that distance between this bit here, which is the so-called solid culture that's good, and this bit here saying, well, it doesn't include me. So do we just finally say, well, let's get rid of all that and just include everyone? Or do we look? And I think it's a very difficult question for curriculum design, because you can get to a point where at a certain point, everyone is excluded at certain points with everything. And if you're trying to say, well, if you call everyone, right, we've got to have English literature, you're fine with women, because you can have women, can't you? You can have lots of women.
Allow women. Yeah,
straight away, you know, so that's all right, you know. But then perhaps in history you haven't got so many women, so we need more women in there, or whatever. I mean, it becomes a very difficult balancing act between the way things were and the way things could be, and
the balancing act is made more difficult. I mean, so you take the example of there are women allowed in the English literature curriculum, but they're allowed, but we don't study them because they wrote books which were inconveniently long. So everybody reads either A Christmas Carol or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde because they're nice and short, but Pride and Prejudice, George Eliot, we don't do those, even though they're allowed, because they just, damn them, they wrote long books. And so the practicalities, you know, the fact that teachers are faced with pragmatic problems of coverage and how to get through specifications are the things which make the actual judgments on the ground, and that seems to cut through, you know, our ideological preferences in ways which are, you know, difficult, problematic.
So if you're going to teach English literature, and you've got to have, how many books can you read on an English literature course over a secondary school? So up to 16 years old. So from year 7 to year 11. How many books can we expect children to actually read in reality? You're saying pragmatically.
So, well, there's an interesting sort of question there. That our expectation of what they might read is interesting, because if we say what most children might read independently, that could be none. Well, for other children, it might be many, many, hundreds of books over a 5-year period.
Thousands of David Walliams books.
Maybe I don't know if he's written 1,000 of them yet. But
Horrid Henry.
all of, but even yes, and the young adult market is obviously it's going back to the idea that popular culture's imposed. There's so much out there aimed squarely at the young adult reader on the young adult shelves that it's difficult for children for young people to break out of what they're supposed to be like, what's for them, which is maybe an interesting development. But if we say how many books could be studied in a traditional sense, where you read them in class and the teacher stops and sort of explains things and then makes you write lots of essays, then that's obviously far fewer. But is that the best way? Is that the best way to do things? Maybe not. If school was about just experiencing more stories, more books, could we expand the curriculum in helpful ways? Maybe, possibly. So it sort of depends on what you mean by reading.
Well, what do you mean by what do we mean by reading? I mean, I suppose studying novels then. I mean, reading and understanding it, what it's all about. Whether it be the book itself, the plot, the characters, the time it was written, the author, all those other things, and the genre and the style, all these other things that then go with it, becomes quite a task, doesn't it? To actually cover some, enough ground. But to me, it's about narrative. So what's the arc?
Yes.
The arc of what we're saying about literature. What is the arc we are saying?
Yeah, what story are you telling?
Yeah, and that must include books that resist, that have different aspects, So, I mean, in history, I always say, you teach British Empire, you must teach colonialism. You have to teach the things side by side, and certain books work next to other books. They juxtapose well, they take you on a story that works quite interestingly. So it's not just a collection of books, it's this book next to this book, then this book, then this book, that doesn't give a seamless narrative of this is the great British tradition of books, this is the great British novel. It's actually, so it's a leave-aside thing. No, but it kind of says, well, this shows you that the difficulties about English literature, or this problematizes it. I think was the second book written in English literature, as the second novel written, I don't know if I got this right, is Tristram Shandy.
Was it the second? This is all fairly contested stuff, but it's I think
what's the first?
It's generally accepted. I think that Defoe is the first official, not Robinson Crusoe is where we begin. But even then, there's a quite an interesting sort of proto novel by Aphra Behn Oronuko, which doesn't quite qualify as a novel for all sorts of boring reasons. But there's a real live, important opportunity to say, here's something from outside of the tradition, which actually, does it speak to the tradition? Was it excluded unfairly? What does it say? It's those sorts of conversations that need to be included, I think, and to push back. If we say the traditional view is Defoe, Sterne, Swift, Fielding, and those are the novels that start it all off. But I think maybe you were going to say something about um, Tristram Shandy being far more postmodern than anything written in the postmodern period.
Well, I wasn't going to say that, but yeah, I mean, it's. I mean, you get this also with the Night of the Burning Pestle as a play as well. I don't know if you know the Night of the Burning Pestle.
Know that.
Oh, you must.
I don't know.
Fantastic play, but it deconstructs itself, and it's a sort of contemporary of Shakespeare's. Well, not quite, but around that sort of. I can't remember now. But Night of the Burning Pestle, look it up.
I will.
But it does a similar thing as Tristram Shandy, in other words. So yeah, straight away there's something going on that says, this is all. We're going to shout about this. We're going to do things slightly different. So that the right to say no, the right to resist, the right to deconstruct things almost as soon as they're being constructed has been there for a very long time. So it's, rather than this sort of seamless narrative, linear narrative of quality, we've also got, a seamless narrative saying, no, it's not, no, it's not, no, it's not, or poking it, or saying, no, is another way of looking, or here is what you're not saying about the empire because it's colonialism, because of this, that, and the other. And we've got, a great tradition there. But having it just a tick box thing that's just bits and pieces of work here and there that aren't part of a narrative, I think is problematic, because then it doesn't fit into the overall. And we're all made in this, we all have a sense of the culture around us, no matter where we are in that relationship, and it needs to bring viewpoints in, perspectives.
Right. It does, and there's a very, very popular poll doing the rounds at the moment, petition, saying that books like The Good Immigrant, the anthology of essays, The Good Immigrant, and René Edo-Lodge's book, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, should be studied in English, and there's a petition that you can sign, and it's off the scale popular, and it's. I've read both of those books, and I think that they have valuable, interesting contributions to the debate. But it's an interesting position to petition like that for a particular books. Obviously, to say that they should be the curriculum in English literature sort of it would be an odd thing. So we're probably not meaning that. And to say that they must be studied in English language, where currently there is no specified curriculum content at all, is equally odd. So it's currently perfectly possible and desirable, arguably, for English teachers to use material from either of those books as a vehicle for expressing ideas that crop up in the English language course. But to establish a new canon in opposition to what already exists, to get rid of what's been considered important and replace it with not necessarily those two books, but the ones that are right and proper for our times, is an understandable urge. And I really get why people feel that young people should be exposed to that kind of writing. But it means then they're dislocated from what's gone before, that the idea of critical thinking, the idea of judgment and choice becomes excluded from the conversation, because how can you know that those are what you should be doing instead if you don't know what else you might have done? It's the instincts of of Orwell's world, where the past is constantly recreated and kept up to date, so that we no longer know what is or was true.
I think this is all part as well of the radical and the conservative mindsets, if you like. If you put them into some sort of emotional, I think it's an emotional thing, actually, that some people feel safe at home with things staying the same, and some people feel excluded by that, or find it oppressive, being born in the suburbs or something like that, where they want to scream and shout, or whatever it happens to be. That there's also the radical idea which is no, it's repressive, it's excluding me, it's you know, and of course both those things can be true. Both those things can be true at the same time, that there is something that some people find important about the inherited culture, if you like, or this is the way the great Western education tradition, or you know, the great Western tradition, whatever that might mean, and the other people saying no, it's excluding me, and if I'm excluded by that, I'm going to fight about it. I mean, I think this is actually, it's one of my favorite quotes about this is Adichie's thing, which is not talking about Western culture here, but talking about the Igbo culture. And here it is. What is the point of culture? Culture functions ultimately to ensure the preservation and continuity of a people. In my family, I am the child who is most interested in the story of who we are, in ancestral lands, in our tradition. My brothers are not as interested as I am, but I cannot participate because Igbo culture privileges men, and only the male members of the extended family can attend the meetings where major family decisions are taken. So although I am the one who is most interested in these things, I cannot attend the meeting because I am female. Now that to me is sums it up beautifully, that we have this sort of the culture, and it's sort of ironic that she finds it, she's the most interested in it, yet cannot participate. Yeah. But she goes on to say we must change the culture to include me. And that tension, which is a dialectical tension, which is Hegelian tension, you know, which is how culture is made and remade, is something we should bring into the school, if you like, because that is where the conversation, Oakeshott's conversation is. This is where the liveliness is saying, well, this is important. And it's there in Antigone. It's there in Antigone, between Creon and Antigone. This whole thing, and it's to me, it's the stuff.
Yes, the wisdom of the tribe versus the need to reinvent, and the tension, the balance between the two being really, really important is obviously right. I find it sort of interesting that I think she also talks about, does she sort of mention the idea that feminism isn't part of African culture?
Yeah, there's another bit there. If I can find it, I don't know if I can.
Well,
I decided I decided to call myself a feminist. Then an academic, a Nigerian woman, told me that feminism was not our culture.
Yeah. And you know, there's something really interesting about that. And I just, you know, if you take, I've just been reading James Shapiro's book, Shakespeare in a Divided America, and he sort of filters various divisions over history in American society and sort of looks at them through the lens of Shakespeare. And one of the interesting stories in there was was rioting in New York, where. And he talks about this, about the division being one of class, where an elitist opera house is attacked by the mob, and an English actor is playing Macbeth, and the mob attack the theatre. They throw stones. They try and burn it down. And the National Guard are called out. The military are mobilised. It all sounds terribly prescient, and end up shooting on the crowd in order to disperse them, and you know, there's blood in the streets and all the rest of it. But for me, the fascinating thing, or one of the fascinating things about this story, is that the riot is about who owns Shakespeare. That the posh people in their white kid gloves, paying a hefty price at the opera house to watch a play, played by an Englishman, you know, an effete Englishman, whereas we've got our own rugged, handsome American actors playing Shakespeare in their own inimitable style in, you know, 15 other theatres on the same night in different parts of New York. You know, that who owns Shakespeare becomes the debate. Is it elitist? No, it's not. It's ours. It's everybody's. We all have the right. You know, nobody should exclude us by charging a premium in a theatre. Nobody should exclude the common man and it was mainly men then, from going to the theatre and their right to enjoy Shakespeare. And there's something sort of really interesting that, and it reminded me, in all the discussion we have about the need to see ourselves in the culture and to find ourselves in the culture. Do you remember I'm paraphrasing here, but in Alan Bennett's play, The History Boys, where the unfortunately paedophile teacher Hector is talking to one of his students, and he makes this comment where he says, sometimes when you're reading literature, you feel that you're connected, and it's like a hand reaches out from the past and takes yours, and even though they might be dead, and it reminded me of, to connect this up, that of something that the Maya Angelou talked about, where as a if you've read I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, sort of how grim her childhood was in the American South as a black girl growing up in the American South, and she talks about reading Shakespeare sonnets, and the sonnet, sonnet 29, I think it is, which begins, "When in disgrace and fortune, with fortune in men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state." And she read this and thought, that's exactly how I feel. That's all of the things, the horrible things that have been inflicted upon me. That's exactly how I feel. And she talked about assuming that Shakespeare must be like her. He must, Shakespeare must be an American black girl from the American South. And when she went to school and said to her teachers, "This is Shakespeare," and they said, "Don't be stupid. Shakespeare was a white Englishman, and he wouldn't have been interested in the likes of you." And her reaction to that was, how could a white man possibly know how I feel? That can't be right.
And this is about meaning. I mean, this is where we find meaning. I mean, I think CLR James talks about how cricket, gave him so much identity, and even though cricket,
quintessentially
what a sport, but used by the colonialists, to civilize. Here we go with the savage. I mean, all this horrendous sort of world around it, and what it was and how it was used, perhaps. But how for CLR James he found his self within that, as a Marxist black Trinidadian, I think, coming to terms with himself, and coming and from an English education out in the West Indies, coming over to Britain, finding the streets not paved with gold, but also finding, I think he went to I'm not sure if this is true, so I'll just paraphrase it, but going to his first test match with the West Indies, and the West Indies won for the first time or something like that. I don't know if it was true that he actually saw, but when the West Indies won for the first time, this incredible moment. He said we were wearing white, but you couldn't change the color of our skin. This moment of empowerment and all that. So I think we're all made within these things. We have different relationships too, but meaning can be found there.
Yeah.
And to dismiss the changing nature of things, or for saying that, well, that's the white man's game, but you can find a place within that. So within the Shakespeare, within that, and if it's taken away as something that's just merely of the powerful or merely oppressive, then the ability to find ourselves within these things becomes difficult, because we're made by these things. We are made by our history, like it or not. It is part of us, and how that then is dealt with.
Well, that's the point.
Handed on to us to look after, but to not preserve the oppressive nature of something.
So I think that's really important. So you meant how it's dealt with becomes, and especially how it's dealt with in schools, is what's important. And you talked earlier about dialectic, and the way that Hegelian dialectic is sort of caricatured as this idea of thesis, antithesis, new synthesis, in the investigation for truth. And there has to be a clash, there has to be disagreement, there has to be, a smashing together to create so that something new can rise from the ashes of that collision. But then, contra that, maybe that's one conception of dialectic which encourages a very combative approach. And then if you look at someone like Bakhtin's approach to conversation, the dialogic principle, that learning from each other doesn't have to be in combat, or Oakeshott's idea that conversation is like gambling. The point is not to win, it's to wager.
It's also important that the dialectic, as for Hegel, isn't thesis, antithesis, bang.
No, let's say how it was caricatured.
But yeah, there's contradictions in the thesis, there's contradictions in the anti. So both are flawed, and we need to examine the flaws in both, if you like. Is an important part of that discursive move through history or whatever, but in the end, then some sort of sense of perfection is reached from that, which I again would then argue against, perhaps, or that's where Marx took it, the dialectic of history.
And we know where that ended up.
Well, some people was anyway. I wouldn't personally, but yeah. So with dialectic, it has to be open that there is not this is perfect.
Yeah.
My view is perfect. Bash that, bash that, bash that.
Right.
That what are the flaws in that? What are the flaws in this? And we look for accommodation. It needs a modest view on ourselves and the works that we're looking at.
Just to return briefly to Leavis, he had a sort of interesting conversational structure that he sort of advocated in his approach to literary criticism, and that the conversation should be initiated by making a point and saying, this is so, is it not? And then inviting a response, and the response should begin with yes, but, and then sort of introduce competing ideas and contradictions and all the rest of it. And there's something that I like about that, which is the politeness of having that kind of formalized, ritualistic almost approach to, I'm going to make a judgment, and I'm going to invite a contrary opinion, and I'm going to give my contrary opinion, but I'm going to do it in a consensual way.
And this is where, to me, it's an important part of a secondary education should be to enable children to develop this way of thinking.
Right.
To learn about viewpoints and how to articulate opposite viewpoints or complementary viewpoints or whatever, in order to get involved in that thinking, that we're not just being told this is the best bump, and we're also not just being told that's all rubbish bump, but actually where thinking is made, where tensions are, where the problems are. And why people might hold this view and this view, and where you find your meaning within those views, or you might end up with another viewpoint or bring something into it later on. But here's a view, here's a critique of Conrad. We're looking at Conrad. Here's some critiques of Conrad.
Yes.
So we can teach Conrad, but we must also teach him as part of a wider view of Conrad and the world in which he inhabits. I
think so. It feels, Martin, that we've arrived quite sort of organically at a consensus here.
And lunchtime. Indeed.
And lunchtime. So it just remains to say, for anyone who's made it to the end of the recording, thanks ever so much for putting up with us. And whether you want it or not, we'll probably do another one at some point. Thanks.